Storytelling for me is the art of what it is to be a human being. We've been telling stories since we arrived on this planet. It's the way we explain who we are, where we've come from, what our wishes and dreams are for the future, and what it is we're actually here to do. So the stories are actually things that have been left behind by previous generations, by previous researchers, by previous human beings that have left like traces. A story is like a footprint. And so as a storyteller, you step into those footprints. And as you step into them, you discover that you are not alone. You discover that there is the wisdom of all the past behind you. And people who have lived before you are often much, much wiser than you are. And they have left you the stories as a kind of signpost for where to go and how to become fully human. So it's the art of becoming fully human is what storytelling is about.
In UK, since when is storytelling perceived as a profession?
There was a great resurgence of storytelling in the UK in the 1980s, I would say. That was when storytelling really began to, I think, become more widely known.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a group of storytellers, three of them, the company of storytellers, Sally Pom-Clayton, Hugh Lupton and Ben Haggerty, who I think really pioneered storytelling or lifted it to another level of awareness. There were storytellers before that like Grace Hallworth from Jamaica, or Jenny Pearson and some others whose names don't come to mind quite now, who were doing it before the company of storytellers, before I started, and but they were far less known. They started back in the 70s or probably even in the 60s, but they were much more lone voices, and then it came more into the mainstream.
And far before, like the traditional storytellers, how was it in UK culture? At which time were they more popular? Do you have an idea?
Well, the most popular time seemed to be the time of the troubadours.
Yeah.
So you know, we're talking about
in
11th, 12th
middle,
century.
yeah.
That sort of time.
Yeah.
And there must have been storytelling and storytellers that were around way after that, because how else did people entertain themselves? And there was probably a lot of fireside storytelling that happened.
Yeah.
But the actual profession of the troubadour, of the trouvère, you know, of the shanachie and things like that, I think went back to that time. In Ireland, I think actually the shanachies and amongst the travelling folk, it's still kept alive. And there was with those people a living tradition which we just caught the end of. And so Duncan Williamson, he is an example of somebody who goes back before the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, because he grew up listening to his grandmother's stories, and she passed them on to him, and then he at a certain point vowed that he would never forget them. I can't remember whether I told you that story, have I?
No.
So he was one of the travelling people. He was one of the, I suppose the word we used to use was gypsies.
Yes.
And he was born in a tent on the side of Loch Fyne in Scotland. And they were people who went around from place to place picking up whatever work they could get, but they also knew many crafts, so they could help out farmers and, you know, at harvest time and things like that, and on the different farms as they went round. But they had all kinds of ways of surviving, and Duncan's grandmother used to always, she smoked a pipe, and she would send him down into the village to get tobacco. And every time he came back with the tobacco, she would say, "Would you like a wee story, Duncan?" And he'd say, "Aye, Granny, I'd love a story." And then she'd say, "Well, let's see what we have inside my little bag." She had a little bag. And then she'd start to tell him a story. And one time he went down to the village and he came back and his grandmother was asleep. But he thought to himself, "How does Granny have all those stories inside that little bag? I'll have a look to see if there's any stories in there, where she gets them all from." So he took the bag out and he looked inside, but there was nothing but, sort of a thimble and a thread and Granny's pipe and just, a pair of scissors and a few things that an old woman would keep. So he quickly put it back and went out to play. And then when he came back in and she was awake and she said, "Would you like a story, Duncan?" "Aye, Granny, I'd love a story." She took the bag and she looked in it. And then she looked straight at him and she said, "You've opened the bag, haven't you?" And he said, "Aye, Granny, I have." And she looked directly at him and she said, "I'll never tell you another story." But, which was kind of, really shocking. When I heard that story first, I thought, wow, gosh, so what did Duncan do? Well, in that moment, he decided that he would never forget another story that he was told. And that he would remember all the stories he'd been told. So actually, when he was discovered by a folklorist called Linda Williamson, who was traveling around, she came from America, and she realized that he had all these stories. She started to record them for the Scottish Archives, and he knew not stories but also ballads and all kinds of things. And he knew 3,000 to 4,000 stories. And he's just carrying them around in his heart, in his memory, in his mind. And that was the kind of that was a sort of folk memory that we all had once, or at least the capacity for that.
Yeah.
And the Irish Shonnachies had the same thing. But I was told a story, and I don't know which Shonnachie it was, which Irish storyteller, but many years back, who used to be able to tell for weeks on end, just keep telling, he'd never run out of stories. And then they gave him a television, when televisions came in as a present, with the best of intentions. Within a year, he couldn't do it anymore.
Really?
He lost it. So, it's inside us somewhere, but
yeah.
Yeah.
What qualities should a storyteller have for you?
The most important quality is listening. And here we need to listen to the story we're telling. We need to listen to our listeners, and if the story is speaking to them. I need to listen to myself as a storyteller. And where the magic lies is listening to what actually arises between us as the story is being told. And even if it's the same story, it will be a story that I told before. It will be different because it's being told in this time to this particular group of people. And there will be an atmosphere in the room, a quality in the room that is unique to that occasion. It will never happen again.
It fulfills some needs of society. That's why it became popular. And which needs might they be?
Well, somebody once told me that the first major storytelling conference that happened, like festival that happened in the United States, was also the same year that the first PC, first personal computer, came on the market.
Interesting.
Which was, I think, in the 80s. I think in the early 80s.
Yeah,
it would have been
80s.
as well. And it's really interesting to look at this. So we've got the internet, and we've got everything that's happening with the whole IT revolution. And in a certain sense, you could say we're more connected than ever. But in another sense, I think we've never been so isolated. And storytelling and computers coming in with a sort of resurgence at the same time. It's very interesting as a gesture. And I think they need each other. Because storytelling actually really, for me, is the glue, is the thing that connects me to you without any kind of... it's the shortest distance between 2 points or between two human beings.
Yeah.
And the simplicity of just sitting down to tell a story, and the way we can meet through that medium, I think is something that we kind of desperately need. So there's not, for me, a single place in modern society where storytelling can't contribute. And because it's very, very ancient and was the first, it is actually our oldest profession. I think it's what we've been doing, since we arrived here. There's something in us that knows why we need stories. So storytelling expands my humanity. It expands my sense of compassion for humanity. It helps me understand that I am not separate from any other human being. There is no other. I'm always, in a funny sense, talking about myself.